Morning, students. So today we'll be talking about South Asia. So we've traveled all the way around the world. Now we are just to the east of, again, what we call the Middle East. So this is South Asia. And predominantly South Asia is India. And we're going to talk about some of the physiographic features. So we'll start out talking about the physical geography of South Asia. So South Asia includes several sub-regions. So those are, again, mostly arbitrary based on political regions. However, what are those regions? Includes India, which is, again, the largest country in South Asia, Pakistan and Bangladesh, as well as the mountain rim, which we're going to talk about that in the mountain rim, and then the island rim. Okay. So again, what are the countries inside of South Asia? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. So those are all the countries within South Asia. So again, if you were to be asked a question on the exam, hint, hint, I might ask you like, where are the countries in the region? Also noting our water. So again, this is a peninsula, so it is surrounded by water, Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. So India largely sits on its own plate. As you can see here, this is actually that region. So if you notice, our Indian plate is pushing up against the Eurasian plate. So the movement of that plate is actually what creates a very large geographic feature. Does anyone know what that geographic feature might be? If you guessed it was the Himalayan mountains, you are absolutely correct. So the Indian plate, as we saw on the last slide, is pushing up against the Eurasian plate. The movement of that plate, which is still continuing to move, pushes up against the Eurasian plate and causes the Earth's crust to lift up. And that creates the Himalayan mountains. So if you remember from way back in the very beginning of the course, we talked about the movement or the convergence of two continental plates, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. The movement of two continental plates lifts up the Earth's crust, creates the Himalayan mountains. So that's actually still happening. The Himalayan mountains continue to grow and move at a rate of about 5 centimeters per year. So it is continuing to lift up. As that happens, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about East Asia, so just to the north side of the Himalayan mountains, it actually lifts up part of the Earth's crust. It creates a giant massive, M-A-S-S-I-F, massive. And that actually, again, lift up block of the Earth's crust, it creates the Tibetan Plateau, which is one of the highest and flattest plateaus on Earth. So that convergence has created some of the physiographic regions that we're going to talk about in more detail. So starting out talking about the mountain rim, as we already mentioned, the Himalayan mountains, but there are several ranges within our Himalayan mountain area. So the Himalayas are kind of like the broader term for this, but we also have the Karakoram Mountains, the Hindu Kush Mountains. Within those mountains, if you can see it, we have K2, as well as Mount Everest, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second, and the Khyber Pass, which is a really important pass that we find within the Himalayan mountains. Again, I'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. So there again, you can kind of see a little bit more focused detail, our mountain rim. All right, so there's an image of K2, which is in the Karakoram mountain range. This is the second highest mountain on Earth, 8,611 meters tall, or 28,251 feet. And take a look at that geographic feature. Does it look young or old? It's rough and craggy and kind of pyramidal shape with sharp edges. Is it young or old geologic feature? If you guessed that that geologic feature was young, you are absolutely correct. It is a young geologic feature. And again, we just discussed there is continuous tectonic movement in this area, right? So it is continuing to cause those mountains to grow. So yes, it is a young geologic feature. And as I pointed out on the map, this is the Khyber Pass. So this allows people to pass between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Has been historically an important pass in this region of the world. So again, in the past, this allowed people to move through this mountain range, and as you might imagine, not an easy thing to do because of the immense size of the mountains. However, in more recent times, we're going to talk about some of the colonial pass of this region. Actually, the British took control of the pass and were blocking passage of the indigenous people through the region. Also allowed them to control the flow of arms, as well as other, defensive items through the mountains, and of course eventually as we have independence in the region, the countries take control again of the Khyber Pass, but very important for the livelihood of the people in the area. So how are people surviving when you live in a really rough mountain range as you see here, right? So mainly they are herding, right? So they are practicing transhumance. Again, if you remember that from sub-Saharan Africa, transhumance, meaning they're following animals with the seasons. Now here, mainly it's going to be dealing with the monsoon rains. So it'll be wet and dry. And especially in these higher elevations, you need to have animals that are adapted to that type of environment. And so that includes sheep, goats, and then yak. So if any of you have ever been to this area, or maybe you've ever been to like an Indian restaurant, sometimes they'll serve like yak butter tea. And apparently it's a very popular tea in the Himalayan mountain range. And basically it is butter made of yak's milk that they put inside of tea. And the idea is, and when you're in these higher elevations and it's very cold, because we know if you go up in altitude, the temperature decreases. You need more calories in order to just stay warm. So they're serving the yak butter tea in order to do that. Also, some of the animals we see here are things like snow leopards, which are found only in the Himalayan mountains, right? And we're going to actually see a little video about our snow leopard. But snow leopard has a really long tail that helps it balance. It's got big wide paws that help it grip on those kind of sharp slopes of our Himalayan mountain ranges, and basically kind of a tough life for any animal to survive, and yet there they are. So here's our video.
This is the boulder-strewn snout of the giant Baltoro Glacier in the Karakoram Mountains of Pakistan. It's the biggest mountain glacier on Earth, 43 miles long and over 3 miles wide. This huge ice-filled valley is so large it's clearly visible from space. This is the greatest concentration of peaks over 5 miles high to be found anywhere on Earth. They're the most dangerous mountains of all. K2 and her sister peaks have claimed more lives than any others. The peaks here rise so precipitously, the glaciers are so steep and crevassed, that few except the most skilled mountaineers can penetrate these ranges. A snow leopard, the rarest of Himalayan animals. It's a female returning to her lair. These are the first intimate images of snow leopard ever filmed in the wild. She greets her one-year-old cub. Her den is well chosen. It has exceptional views of the surrounding cliffs. On these treacherous slopes, no hunter other than a snow leopard would have a chance of catching such agile prey. A female with young makes an easier target. Her large paws give an excellent grip, and that long tail helps her balance. Silently, she positions herself above her prey. She returns with nothing.
So that gives you a little idea of what life might be like in the Himalayan mountains. Obviously not an easy place to live, and you never know in those videos, should you feel bad for the snow leopard or happy that our little Littre was able to get away, our antelope, right? But yeah, that is what life looks like in the Himalayan mountains. Okay, so we've talked about that. So here's an image of Mount Everest, the Himalayas, which is found in the Himalayas in Nepal. This is the highest mountain on Earth. So that one just a little bit taller than our K2, as you can see here. Just actually let me go back really quick. Okay, well, let me go back. All right, so if you can see like kind of life here, obviously kind of built around that. And when we think of tall things kind of overall globally, we think about Mount Everest, right? It's something that is, you know, when you say something as tall as Mount Everest, and then here we have an image from actually New York where they had called their scaffolding company Everest. Okay, so if you can see, here's Mount Everest. That's all I wanted to do is go back and show you that. So there's Mount Everest, where that one is. There's K2 again, and the Hindu Kush Mountains, the Khyber Pass. All right, so let's talk about the next physiographic region, which is our plains region. So you can actually see that here. So here's our, again, our mountain rim, right, where all those mountains are. And then just as you're coming down off the mountain, you enter the plains region. So that's what you're seeing here. And if you see, again, as we've talked about in many different areas of the world, this is where we find our major rivers. So we have our Ganga or Ganges River in this area, Brahmaputra also originating. Again, they're originating in the mountains, but they're flooding down into our plains area. The Indus River originating again up here, but as you can see, many branches of that river coming down into the plains region, as well as the Thar Desert, which is here. So this area is prone to drought anyway. So as we're going to discuss when we talk about the monsoon rains, those are critically important for the livelihood of the people living in this area. And so, again, in the northern part where people predominantly concentrating around the Indo-Gangic Plain. All right, so that's kind of up in this area, and we're going to look at that in more detail in just a second. But down here, we have a region called the Sundarbans, which I'm going to show you another image of that later on. But this is an estuarine region, so estuaries, just like we have on the coast of Florida. And again, where is that originating from? It's from the Brahmaputra rivers. All right, so actually, and the convergence of that Brahmaputra River and the Ganga, again, or Ganges River, those two major rivers flowing into this area. All right, so our Indus Plains. All right, here's a little more detailed image of that. So we're here at Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as you can see, the Thar Desert just to the south of our Indus Plains. All right, so together with those Ganga, Brahmaputra rivers, the northern plains, some of the world's most intensely farmed areas. So what exactly does that mean? Well, if we think about in contrast to where we had farming in the United States, which is that large-scale factory farming, they might be growing one crop over thousands of acres. Here in this region, you'll have multiple farmers on very small plots of land growing multiple different types of things. So basically the complete opposite of the way that farming is done in the United States. So again, many people reliant on the rivers for survival. And as we're going to talk about, that's not always something they're able to have, right? And this is, again, one of the most densely populated areas of the world. So if we have any kind of drought, that could be catastrophic. Okay, and as you can see, where are our major our major cities concentrated? They're along this river. And as you can see, a lot of them are quite large, from 1 to 5 million or more than 5 million, all along this river system. Okay, so what does that look like? So again, the rivers are originating in the mountain areas, and that water from rainfall, when we have the monsoon rains or when the snow melts after the winters, we're going to get a flood of that water and also dirt, sediment as it says here, flowing down off the mountain and flowing into the plains, right? So I'm going to show you that, right? So that's what happens, and that's something we call, again, the alluvial plain. And if you remember when we talked about California and those outwash areas, that's pretty much exactly the same thing. You're getting very fertile sediment that's coming off of the mountain. You're getting water, so that's fresh water, and it's all flooding down in these plains. And again, if you can see that patchwork kind of look to the land here, that is farms, right? So critically important for the farming of this region. All right, so our peninsular highland. Peninsular highland is that purple region on the map, mainly dominated by the Deccan Plateau as well as the Ghats system, and I'm going to go in more detail in just a second. All right, so there you go. So our Deccan Plateau, high and flat. When we think about plateaus, again, it's high and flat, right? And they're dominated by those two mountain ranges. They're really not very high mountain ranges. They're the Ghats systems, so the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats. So our Deccan Plateau, what is that looking like? Well, that's a really interesting geologic formation. So again, remember that the Indian plate crashed against the Eurasian plate. And when that happened, it was a major tectonic event. And so as that happened, lava starts to flood down into the northwestern part of this peninsula. Oops, God, I can't go backward apparently. So that lava then buries part of the peninsula. And so if you were to dig down into the rock, the bedrock of this region, you'd see those lava flows, those layers of sediment, right? So what does life look like on the Deccan Plateau? This is actually a relatively dry region. If you can remember when we were talking about availability of fresh water globally, this area struggles almost as much as the Middle East. So very little water, really very small villages found in this region. So unlike our Indus Plains, that area which was very densely populated, this area less so. Very small villages, relying on subsistence agriculture. Remember, subsistence agriculture is we're going to produce enough food for us to survive. That's it. So really we could call India, and that picture is changing, but we call India the land of villages, right? Because there are so many small villages. Most people are still living in a rural setting. It's not highly urban as we see in other parts of the world, although again, that picture is changing. All right, so our GATT systems, remember I just mentioned those. So our Western Ghats are a biodiversity hotspot. So you can see those mountain ranges are far more eroded than our Himalayan ranges. So you can see that very soft look to the mountains, heavily eroded. And we're going to talk about that, the wind patterns carry wind this way, right, across our Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, into India. They get plenty of water, so that means that they are, really able to support a lot of life here. As opposed to our Eastern Ghats, which again are very heavily eroded, getting less water because getting less rainfall on that side, in parts of it, right? So they are a little bit less of a biodiversity hotspot, but still we do see a lot of population density in both these areas. All right, so that's really part of our coastal fringe for physiographic region. So let's talk about that in more detail. This also includes our island areas. So the Maldives, so on the map, kind of hard for you to see, but those little tiny dots are our Maldives, or Maldives, however you want to pronounce it, and then our Sri Lanka, right, which is also known as Ceylon. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the human geography of this region. And this area known as the Coromandel Coast. This is the Malabar Coast, and then the Konkan Coast. All right, so I just wanted to point that out for you guys. All right, so what do the Maldives look like? Here we go, or Maldives, right? So mostly these are unpopulated. It's a lot like when we talked about our Pacific Islands. There are small islands. There's not a lot of fresh water or, other resources on the islands. So the bulk of the islands are uninhabited. In the past, human occupation, people might have moved kind of freely throughout the Maldives, going, to each island for like resource extraction, and then going back to the larger islands where there was fresh water and there were more resources. Obviously, today you find these as tourist spots. All right, and then I already talked about our river systems, but just to point those out in more detail, our Indus River originating in the Tibetan Plateau and flowing out to the Arabian Sea, the Brahmaputra River originating in the Himalayan mountains, flowing out to the Bay of Bengal, which also again creates the Sundarbans, the Ganga River, same originating point, same exit, and the Bay of Bengal. All right, so in terms of our rivers in South Asia, this is highly important for life in this region. So again, these are where we find agriculture, just like when we talked about our Nile River, people concentrated around the Nile River. That was where we found agricultural zones. But more importantly for this area is population concentration. So again, we're going to talk about that when we talk about the human geography in more detail, but as you can see, roughly 1.3 billion people live along the river systems in South Asia, and 3 billion people depend on the fresh water that comes from those rivers. So this is actually nearly 1/2 of the world's population. So when we talk about those rivers, they are critically important for our human survival in this area. our Sunderbans, an image of that. And actually what we're looking at is the delta, right? So if you can imagine the Mississippi Delta, we talked about that just a little bit when we talked about the United States and Canada. So where you have a delta is where, if you remember, sediment is washing off the mountains and flowing through the river, which can be a huge problem when we talk about flooding. But that sediment then flows into the water and creates this very rich area. It's really high in nutrients, good for our plants, good for the estuary, which is here, that Sunderban, largest mangrove forest in the world. But it creates a delta, right? So very crucial for the survival of many different animal species, including the Bengal tiger. All right, so I've mentioned it before, and what's one of the major features of this region are the monsoon rains, right? Those are crucial for survival of the people in this area. All right, so what is the monsoon? Those are heavy seasonal downpours, seasonal rains. They happen daily, and they are a result of shifting wind patterns. So I'm going to show you that in just a second. But that word monsoon is an Arabic word. That's what it means, heavy wind or great wind. So we have two different monsoon patterns, one occurring in the summer and then one occurring in the winter. So our summer rains are our wet rains, or the wet monsoon. That's occurring from June to September. So again, we're north of the equator. And then the dry monsoons happening in the winter, October to May. We'll talk about that. So there we go. Here's our wind patterns. All right, so what's going on? So as we're coming out of the winter, remember that water will both heat up and cool down more slowly than the land. So in the summer, a low pressure system is forming on the land space, right? Meanwhile, the water is staying cooler. So a high pressure system is out here in the water. So what happens then is, this is a law of physics, high flows to low. So our high pressure system is going to pass over our Indian Peninsula and move into the Eurasian continent. And what happens is, as it meets up against that Himalayan mountain range, so if you can remember, the Himalayas are right here, it's going to drop its rain. So that orographic precipitation, the rain shadow effect happens. So very heavy rainfall in the plains region of South Asia. And noticing the movement of our winds, this is due partially to the movement of our Earth itself, as well as, again, the movement of our intertropical convergence zone and those other air pressure systems. So all of that causing our air currents to flow in this direction. And what happens, if you notice, is it's passing over the Arabian Sea, passing over the continent. Now it's largely flat. We got that Deccan Plateau, some of it falling on our Malabar and Konkan coasts, but most of it making its way to the Himalayan mountains. It's passing over the Bay of Bengal, and in both those areas picking up moisture. All right, so it's bringing heavy rainfall during the summer months. Then the winter monsoon, the opposite happens, okay? So our water is now really warm from having been the summer, so a low pressure system is hanging out in the water. And because the land is starting to cool down pretty rapidly, a high pressure system forms on the land. Again, laws of physics, high is going to flow to low. That high pressure system passes over the Indian Peninsula through South Asia. And as you can see, that's largely going to be dry because that system is now just passing over land, so it's not picking up moisture, except for as it passes over the Bay of Bengal. So our Coromandel coast, so in Sri Lanka, in that area, it's going to get some rainfall in the winter months, but largely this will be a dry monsoon. So our summer monsoon, the wet monsoon, our winter monsoon is the dry monsoon. And again, that has a major landscape effect, right? So prior to the monsoon, you can see it's super dry. Usually, actually, by the time that monsoon has come along, we are starting to see some erosion, some heavy drying out of the landscape. And then post-monsoon, after that happens, as you can see, has created this lush green landscape as a result of all of the rainfall that they get in this area. And that's when you start to see the heavy planting season, right? And very rain tolerant plants like rice, obviously loving this area because, hey, there's a ton of water. So again, this is just that same thing that I was talking about, just in words, right? So in our summer monsoon, the wet areas, so that Ganges, Brahmaputra Delta, the lower Ganges Valley, and then our Malabar coast, right? And then in the winter monsoon, you can see that here is the Coromandel coast, and then in Sri Lanka, and then pretty much dry everywhere else. So the major effect of that, the impact of that, is due to that rain shadow effect, the orographic precipitation. So here you can see that happening, that moisture moving up against the mountains, being forced upward, aloft, and where it condenses and falls as rain. So that, of course, influences the climate of Asia, of South Asia, right? So here in our mountain area, we have our highland region. In Afghanistan, Pakistan is largely arid and semi-arid. Of course, along our Indus rivers and the river system there is area for agriculture, so it's going to be a little bit wetter. But remember, there's the Thar Desert right there. So this is largely a desert region. Again, very dependent on the monsoon rains in order to maintain the livelihood of the people here in this area. In our plains region, largely it is humid subtropical, so very similar to most of Florida. We have that very high rainfall and wet and hot in the summer, and then mild winters. As you move into the interior of our Indian Peninsula, it is a tropical savanna. So basically those seasonal hot and dry and wet and also warm. And then in our coastline, we've got just a little bit of the monsoon climate, right? So that means in a monsoon climate, it's pretty much going to be wet all the time. Very similar to that tropical wet, right? You're not going to have any dry season. And then, again, we see that tropical wet in Sri Lanka. All right, so how do people adapt to that type of climate? Clearly, this is going to be a challenge. So in our highland areas, we're going to have terracing. So we talked about that a little bit when we talked about the Andes Mountains and how the Incas adapted to life here. And you can really see it here in the Himalayas and the Karakoram. And basically, again, that's where you cut steps into the side of the mountain. And this serves numerous purposes. It's going to slow down erosion, right? Because as waterfall is coming, down off the top of the mountain, as the snow is melting or as heavy rains, as water is coming down off of the mountain, if it is just its normal mountainside, it's going to just whoosh straight down the side like a water slide. So by cutting those steps into the sides of the mountain, you're able to limit the flow of that water so it's not moving so fast. It also allows us to create areas to plant, because again, if you have these very steep sides to the mountain, obviously it's not a flat area, so not easy to plant plants in those areas, and creates little zones where you could plant different types of plants. We also see intercropping, just as we saw in sub-Saharan Africa. So recall, intercropping, very crucial for survival in areas where you're getting just kind of various amounts of waterfall. So, especially like Afghanistan, Pakistan, or in the Deccan Plateau. So some plants can survive with heavy rainfall. Some plants can survive with just a few inches of rain. So for example, millet, a very popular plant in this area, is something we'll see here. So millet and rice. So you might plant those together. And what that does is our millet can survive with very little water. Our rice needs maybe more water to survive. So if you have a drought season, the millet makes it, the rice might not. If it's a very wet season, you might drown the millet, but the rice makes it. So you always have one plant that makes it to harvest. And then again, as we've talked about before, transhumance. So people following those herd animals around with the seasons, particularly in this area, the yak. So that's Y-A-K, the yak. So as I mentioned before, this is known as the land of villages. because of all the numerous small villages. Many people here are living in a rural setting. That picture, of course, is changing as India starts to urbanize. People start moving into cities. But again, most people living in a rural setting in South Asia. Also, what we've seen in this area of the world is something called the Green Revolution. Now, that's a little bit different than our Green Revolution that we talk about here in the United States, where we're using our green cleaners or using organic farming. In South Asia, the Green Revolution, it refers to increased crop yield. So in this particular case is rice, right? So our, we were having a huge population boom in this area post-colonialism, and the people here needed, more food. And they were worried about food running out. So they started increasingly using chemical fertilizers in order to increase the crop yields, and that really did increase the crop yields exponentially. However, just like we've talked about before, it's a little bit of an arms race, right? Because as you start applying more and more chemical fertilizers, you're really stripping away a lot of the healthiness of the soil, and it becomes dependent on those chemical fertilizers in order to survive. Well, in doing so, then now they have to keep applying more and more chemicals, and there's a little bit of a shift now back to producing food without chemical help. All right, so what are some of the hazards that we see in South Asia? Well, one of the major risks is the risk of flooding. As you can see on the slide, which is India Peninsula, receives from 79 to 158 inches of rain in the monsoon season. So that's annually, right? So obviously that can bring a lot of risk. So for example, in Pakistan in 2010, the flooding of the Indus River actually impacted 20 million people. If you recall, about 3 million people, or about 1/3 of the world's population, dependent on the water from these rivers, right? So if they flood, if they break the banks, it's not just that water. Remember, when we're talking about flooding like in Egypt, or it was on the Mississippi River, et cetera, what's coming with it is sediment. It's coming with dirt, right? And that is what is the major hazard, because it breaks the banks, and that heavy water laden with dirt is going to just take out the villages. And that's exactly what happened in Pakistan. So a ton of people died, lost their homes, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the opposite side, we get drought, right? So we are seeing both of those things, flooding and drought, exacerbated by climate change. So one of the problems with climate change is it causes the weather patterns that we know, that we're familiar with, that are predictable, to change. So in this area, if you can recall, mainly our winds pass this way, right? So again, over that Indus plain, people are counting on that. But if those winds shift this way, then this whole area, which is a desert region anyway, is going to be suffering from drought, and that has happened as a result of climate change. Or if our winds shift this way, so more towards Afghanistan, Pakistan, we might get very heavy flooding because they are not prepared for that volume of water to fall in that area. Or if the winds are late, right, which we've seen happen recently as a result of climate change. Those winds come late. And remember, right up to that point of where we're starting to get those monsoon rains, so we're talking about, late May, June, when those monsoon rains start, people would be completely without fresh water, right? So the snow melt has already happened possibly, and now they're lacking of fresh water. And of course, if they're not getting any snow in the winter, and it's a dry area really in this Tibetan plateau, then they might not have any fresh water at all. And since such a huge population density lives here, they're susceptible to that. So all of those things are concerns for the people living in South Asia. Other problems, so tropical cyclones. Actually, I think this happened fairly recently. So a cyclone, is a hurricane, just like we have here all the time in Florida, and they do form in the Indian Ocean. It's pretty warm, so we have that same system where you're getting warm water that's feeding our hurricanes, and then they're able to pass into the land. Hurricanes or cyclones, same thing, right? So Bangladesh, particularly vulnerable to those hurricanes because it's such a low-lying country. It's on the coast, and again, very densely populated. I'm going to show you some images of that when we talk about our human geography of the region, but that area is very densely populated, so tons of people impacted when we have these tropical cyclones happening. So you can kind of see that in a little bit more detail here, right? Very vulnerable across regions, and who is vulnerable, of course, is going to vary across these different levels, right? So social, political, because we do see the caste system here in South Asia, right? So people who are considered a low caste or low socioeconomic rank, you know, obviously they're going to be the most vulnerable to climate change or those type of things. Also, just people living in extreme poverty, which we'll talk about, this absolute desperate poverty in this area. So they're mainly living in, you know, a shack or some very vulnerable housing. So when a cyclone comes in, we know that we have our houses here, which are made out of concrete, and some of them get the roof ripped off. I mean, if your house is made out of, you know, cardboard, the house is going over. And kind of along with that, which we have talked about before, you know, you're getting other hazards like malaria, because you're getting any kind of standing water, so it allows mosquitoes to bloom, you know, or to mate. And you've got yellow fever epidemics, you have cholera. So waterborne illnesses, particularly hazardous in this area, especially because of all of these natural disasters happening. Other problems, which are not in the slide, but tsunamis also possible in this area, because just to the east is some active plate boundaries. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about East Asia. But tsunamis can impact this area. Actually, there was a tsunami in the Indian Ocean, I believe it was in 2004, that impacted, you know, thousands of people in India. So they were just wiped out, basically. So they've got, you know, hurricanes, we've got drought and flooding, and then also tsunamis. So one way that they're combating that, at least for the cyclones, is actually social media. So in 2009, they developed this cyclone warning system using text messages, but also I've seen some more recent work where they were using social media, so things like Twitter, to get warning systems out, because, you know, you want to have something that might be possibly low tech or could be used in areas where there's a lower cell phone connection. All right, so now we'll be talking about the human geography of South Asia, or the peoples of South Asia. And this area has the fastest growing growth rate in the world, second largest population after China. So very densely populated, which is going to, of course, affect the people living in this area, and we're going to be discussing that throughout the presentation. All right, because I'm an archaeologist, we're going to talk about some of the early civilizations and empires that we saw in talking about the early civilizations and empires. So one of the earliest civilizations that we see in this region is the Indus Valley civilization. As you might imagine, they emerged around the Indus Valley, so around the Indus River in the Indus Plain that we talked about before. So this group was actually really large, based on the buildings and the sites that they left behind, probably at least 5 million plus people as a part of the civilization. So this was beginning in about 8,000 BC, going up to the Golden Age. The peak of their civilization is about 2,500 BC. So, you know, roughly the same time as Mesopotamia, just as we talked about when we talked about the Fertile Crescent. They're growing their civilization around the Indus River. And one thing for archaeologists that's sort of been difficult is the fact that we do not have any transcription of their language. So they did have a language, but we don't understand what it is. So there was no Rosetta Stone that would tell us what they were trying to say. All right, so again, there's our Indus Valley civilization. So this is the mature phase. This is basically when the civilization starts to decline. And we saw over time that, unfortunately, the Indus River starts to shift. So what that meant was that people could no longer support themselves around the Indus River, and they start moving away from the area and the civilization collapses. So the next group, and this actually invades our Indus Valley group, is the Aryan group. So they're primarily found in the Ganges Plain, so a little bit further to the east. And during this time, we see the development of Sanskrit as a language, as well as the emergence of Hinduism as a religion. Buddhism also emerges during this time, so Buddha being from northern India, that religion makes its way into East Asia. We'll talk about that when we talk about East Asia. And so those religions are evolving simultaneously in this area. So eventually the Aryan group gives way to the Gupta civilization, and there's a map showing Gupta. So sort of interesting, and I'll talk about that more in just a second, but all of these groups did not go all the way down into the Deccan Plateau and down to Sri Lanka. Actually, that area remains pretty sparsely populated until much later. But in any case, Gupta, really golden age for India. This is where we see the development of the decimal system, a flourishing of architecture, sculpture, painting, so all different kinds of discoveries in art and in other artistic pursuits. We also see during this time Sanskrit is still the dominant language. It's actually the lingua franca of the area at the time. And eventually we have the waves of the Mughal Empire. So this brings us actually to the modern period. So the Mughal Empire, they are Muslim. They make their way in from the Middle East, so from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and you can kind of see from the different colored lines. So this is really extending into right before we have our colonial period in India. So initially taking over this area, the Indus Plains, and then eventually taking the mountain rim, and then finally almost all the way down to our Sri Lanka. And one thing was unique with our Mughal Empire, so they were Muslim, and as they come in, at first they were, as is typical for conquerors, they're forcing the people to convert to their language, to their religion, and what they realized was that way wasn't going to work, so they actually start practicing Dharma, which is good works, right? So they have non-violence. That's actually a principle in Buddhism as well. And they just decided not to force the people to speak their language or to practice their religion, and they could convert if they wanted to. And so quite a few people did convert to Islam. Then we reach the colonial period. So colonial period starting in the 1700s, and initially that is the British East India Company. All right, so early 1600s into the 1700s, it's the British East India Company. And the interesting thing with the British East India Company compared to later is that even though they are a piece of the crown, they are their own separate entity. So they're not taking orders from the crown. They're basically doing whatever they want to do. But in the late 1700s, there is actually a rebellion against British rule, and the crown steps in and says, okay, well, British East India Company, you can keep acting in this area, but we're going to take more control of the region. And that continues into the 1950s. Still during this time, most of the Indian people want freedom. They do not want to be colonized by the British. So they're continuing to try and push the British out. And so in the 1850s is when we really start to see more full-scale rebellion against British control. So some of the things that we see in this area are a real influence of British culture. So for example, cricket. Many of the people play cricket in India as a result of having been colonized by the British. There are also many Christian churches inside of India as a result of, again, having Britain in the area. Many of the people speak English. They are also, educated in English schools. So there's that heavy influence of having been a British colony. And interestingly, we do think about it just being the colonizers forcing their culture on this region, and they did that. But the Indian culture also making its way back to Britain. So one of the most popular dishes in Britain is curry. All right, so we see a lot of curry dishes coming from India into Britain, as well as silks and things of that nature, part of the Indian culture. So again, this is lasting into the 1850s, and our Indian groups are really pushing for freedom. They still don't want to have British rule. So the Crown again steps in and makes some direct decisions. So they put in place the Raj system. So the Raj system lasts from 1857 until World War II. And what that was basically they're making, there's princes of the different provinces throughout India, and they make those princes as a part of the British monarchy. They're figureheads, they really don't have any authority, but because of their loyalty to the crown, they're going to say, all right, then you can be the prince of this region. And basically at that point, they're taking control of the people around them. So during this time, one of the motivations for the British to have control over India is it is a port, a passageway through on the Silk Road. So goods, if you remember, coming from China, making their way through to eventually Britain, right? Passing through India, also going into the Middle East. And many products are coming out of India, like silks, spices, and tea. So if you can picture, what is the thing we associate with Britain is tea. And one thing that the British wanted was a commercial advantage in Northeast India, because due to that Silk Road, China at this point had control over the tea market. So they wanted their own tea market. So at this point, Sri Lanka is known as Ceylon. And at that point, there were coffee plantations all over Ceylon. Well, the coffee plantations were destroyed by a blight. So a British individual by the name of Lipton steps in and buys the plantations. So yes, that is the Lipton tea that you drink now. This is that individual. He's the one that buys the coffee plantations and then converts them to tea plantations. So as a result of that, and this is across the board, the Indian people as well as the British forced then the lowest castes to work on the plantations to farm the tea, usually in horrible conditions. So as we are approaching World War II, so we've passed the 1850s, the Raj system is in place. During this time, we see the emergence of the Indian National Congress Party. And really, one of the main drivers of the Indian independence is Gandhi. So he practices a method of nonviolent civil disobedience. And he is the leader of the Indian National Congress Party. And again, what are they pushing for is independence from British rule. And finally, they achieved that in 1947. So in 1947, we're kind of in the middle of World War II, but Britain releases its colonial holdings in India. And so what they decide to do is partition India. So just to clarify, if you see on the map here, this red line, at that time, everything south of that line was called India. So while I know now there are numerous other countries in those areas, at that time it was all called British India. All right, so I think trying to be helpful in a way, but not really, Britain decides to partition India. And what they decide to do is make the model of Europe the model for India. So in Europe, if you remember, those very small countries come about because of particular groups speaking the same language, practicing the same religion. So that's what they decide to do here. We're going to partition India based on religion. So the Raj, the princes, could decide which they wanted to go to, but India was going to be Hindu and Pakistan was going to be Muslim. So what happens then is you can see we have India, what we would call India today, and we have the emergence of what is West Pakistan and East Pakistan. So they were both Pakistan, but divided by India, that was where we have Muslim. So those two areas were going to be predominantly Muslim, India going to be Hindu. Then some of the areas were under dispute almost immediately, because what happens is our Maharaja, the prince, who is Muslim, decides to go with Pakistan, and the bulk of the people there are Hindu. And so if you can see on the map, what begins pretty much immediately after this decision is the largest migration of people in recorded history, because people start moving from one country to another to be in the area where they're practicing their religion. So those areas that you see in the map that are hashed, those are areas that actually happen as riots immediately following partition. The brown arrows are the movement of our Muslim refugees. The blue arrows are the movements of our Hindu and Sikh refugees. One of the areas that was not included in a partition plan but immediately becomes an area of contest is Kashmir. So India lays a claim to it, China lays a claim to it, and part of the reason is because the origin point for our Indus River is in this region. So everybody wants control of Kashmir. And as you can see, the little red kind of looking like explosion, those are areas where we had border conflicts, people fighting over control of those borders. So all along the border between India and West Pakistan, between China and Kashmir, and between what becomes Bhutan and Tibet. All right, so in disputed Kashmir, as I said before, this area was not included in the partition plan, but again, everybody wanted control of it. So I don't know if you can visualize again in your mind, but this area is where our Indus River originated, and Pakistan wants a piece of it, India wants a piece of it, China wants a piece of it, and they basically are all fighting over control of this. So the situation as it stands today, still disputed over who gets control. So as you can see, this part of Kashmir controlled by Pakistan, this part controlled by India, part of it being controlled by China, but being claimed by India. And remember, in this region in South Asia, India is really the most dominant country. All right, and if you recall previously that West Pakistan and East Pakistan, all right, they're divided by India. Well, West Pakistan eventually becomes known as Bangladesh. They're still Muslim, but they did not want to be under Pakistan control. So in 1971, they become their own country. So they were fighting for independence, actually with the assistance of India, fighting for independence from Pakistan in 1971. They become their own country and become Bangladesh. So post economic struggles that we see from a result of, okay, now we have our British rule that has moved out, what are we going to do instead? Some positive things and some negative things. So we see very rapid growth. So just right after we have the removal of British rule, and obviously we had a lot of turmoil over boundary disputes. As those things settle down, India focuses on domestic markets, trying to improve that, and that's where we came up to where we are now. So focusing on particularly things like IT, so in the quaternary sector of the economy, if you remember what that means, so pure information, so call centers, as well as, again, to focus on developing the domestic market. So while they previously had traded silks and spices and tea outside of the country, now focusing on keeping that inside the country. As a result, as it says, second fastest growing economy after China, a growing middle class, which allows for a larger consumer culture, because there's a larger group of people that have the money to actually buy things. So if you can see in this map here, our pink areas are where we have the growth of industrial regions. So previously, anything they produced was going back to Britain to be manufactured into whatever products they wanted. Now India is focusing on creating their own product. And if you remember when we had discussions about economics, that's really where the money is to be made. If you are making your own product, producing your own product, then you will get the money from it versus sending the raw product out of the country. We also see some expansion in terms of like mining and things of that nature. So as far as IT, that is really a, don't want to say benefit, but it was a side effect of having been a British colony. So we have a large population. They are educated in English speaking schools, so they all speak English in addition to other languages. They're also in a different time zone of the world. When we are asleep, they're awake and vice versa. So people could call 24 hours and be able to reach somebody. So that was really one of the reasons why people start shifting call centers to India. So one of the groups that emerges after we have British control is the Tata Group. So this is a multinational corporation based in Mumbai and the largest private company in India. So they focus primarily on automobile production, but also steel, IT, power, so energy sources, and hotels. And one thing I have looked at, I didn't really realize how much control they had over tea, but if you go and get a box of tea, on the back of it, it's Red Rose tea, if you've ever seen that in the grocery store. It says from the Tata Group, so they're the ones who produced it. So one of the things that they have made is the Tata Nano. So it's a relatively inexpensive car, as you can see, about 2,000 American dollars, and it's called the world's cheapest car. So why were they creating the cars? Basically, again, aimed at the population that's in Bangladesh and in India. So not wealthy countries, so also not a lot of space. So we're going to create small cars that are affordable. But remember that we have a huge population in India. So there's a lot of environmental implications over getting that many people on the road. So it's a good thing for economics, it's a bad thing for the environment. In 2008, Tata purchased Jaguar and Land Rover for $2 billion. So if you are lucky enough to own one of those cars, it was actually produced by the Tata Group, so our Indian group that has helped the economy here. So what are some of the other livelihoods among people who are not working in IT, who are not in the middle class? So some of that could include things like rug weaving, right? So predominantly for rug weaving, we'll have children actually producing the rugs. They have really small fingers, so it's easy for them to weave the rugs. Women are also one of the ones that are likely to be weaving the rugs. And we have a lot of issues in terms of our labor. So as you might imagine, as in other parts of the world, women and children are the ones that are usually bearing the brunt of economic struggles. So women are often both responsible for getting money for the family as well as raising the children. So they have to work jobs in which they could have the children with them or allows them some flexibility. So again, rug weaving is an industry where they might be likely to work. Often they bring their children with them and or their children are working with them. So especially with both the women and children, they may end up being forced to work super long hours, so 14 to 16-hour days. Sometimes they will actually chain them to the machines to keep them working. So very difficult economic struggles here in this part of the world, and as I said before, very desperate poverty for the people who are living here. So what are some of the solutions to this? So traditionally, so the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, would consider loaning any of these people any kind of money a bad risk because they don't have any way to pay it back. Well, the Grameen Bank is operating against those type of principles and loaning money. It's usually about $150 to women in this region. And women will purchase a cow that can produce milk for the family, or often will purchase a silkworm shed where they could produce silk. And so the Grameen Bank is unusual in another way. So they're unusual because they loan money to these women who are high risk, but it's also unusual in the rate of return. 97% of the loans that are given to these women are paid back, unlike traditional loans, which are often defaulted on. So while that's a really positive thing, again, they're still dealing with child labor issues. And one of those child labor issues is the bonded labor system. So the bonded labor system, in this system, the parents put their own labor up as a bond to secure a loan. And that means they're going to be working for whomever gave them a loan. But sometimes their own labor is not enough. So they also have to put up their child's labor to secure the bond for the loan. So as we saw in other more poverty-stricken areas of the world, we also practice a lot in the informal economies. So again, shoe shining, you can see this man is giving this guy a shave right there on the street. So shoe shining, shaving, selling fruit. Often they'll go and pick from the trash, they'll pick minerals and rags that can be used to weave into cloth. So informal economy, remember, is anything that's outside the normal economy. So outside anything that is going to be regulated by the government. It's not taxed, but it's also not steady, so they can't count on that income. So again, shoe repair is another thing that might happen in the street. An incense seller, right? So you could purchase that from a street. So one of the other issues that people in this area face is water contaminated with arsenic. So arsenic occurs naturally in the groundwater in this region, especially in Bangladesh. So the deeper water has less arsenic. So people have started to try and tap into the deep groundwater in order to bring up this water that is not laden with arsenic. And also the surface water has been largely contaminated by from garbage and other pollution, right? So unfortunately, when they bring that water up, sometimes they're also creating a situation where now we're releasing the arsenic in a form that is, again, harming humans. And as you can see in this image, those are just some of the effects of drinking water laden with arsenic. So 43,000 people die per year from arsenic poisoning in water. So these are some of the areas that are affected by that. Obviously, China or Nepal, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the worst in that particular region of the world, but also United States, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, other areas of the world also affected by arsenic. So I'm going to have just a very short clip about the science behind this.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Cynthia Graber. This will just take a minute. It seemed like a good idea. Because rivers and ponds in Bangladesh were contaminated with bacteria, Bangladeshis switched to wells. But soon after, in the early 80s, researchers realized those wells were harming Bangladeshis with a new poison, arsenic. The underground sediment of the Ganges Delta contains arsenic. In 2002, MIT researchers determined that microbes digesting organic carbon were freeing that trapped arsenic. But where did the carbon come from, and how is the arsenic getting into the water supply? The MIT team now thinks they have the answers, which they report in the journal Nature Geoscience. Using a 6-square-mile test plot, they found that the organic carbon comes from shallow ponds that were dug to provide soil for flood protection. The carbon compounds sink in the pond water and seep underground where bacteria digest them, setting up the perfect chemical conditions to free up the soil's arsenic. Groundwater flow then brings the arsenic-rich water to the wells. Future wells dug deep enough to the low arsenic part of the aquifer could help. Rice fields filter arsenic from the water, so wells under those fields could also be part of an answer to a problem affecting millions of Bangladeshis. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Cynthia Graber.
So what are some solutions to fixing this problem? How can we take care of that? Well, one of those things is painting the pump handles. So the Bangladeshi government painted the pump handles. If it was a red pump handle, it meant that it had arsenic. If it was a green pump handle, it was safer. So the water may or may not have had arsenic in it. Unfortunately, a lot of the people didn't necessarily pay attention to that, and as we talked about before, this area is sometimes prone to drought. So basically, if a well dried up that had the green pump handle, they just took the green pump handle and moved it over to a different area that might have also been contaminated with arsenic. So They're not necessarily paying attention to that problem, which just continues that same issue of people dying from arsenic poisoning in the water. Right now, no easy solutions to that problem, unfortunately. Scientists working on that, but in order to get the arsenic from the water, we need to put in some infrastructure to help remove it. So we have increasing urbanization in this area. So people moving from the rural areas to the urban cityscape, as you can see here. But what that looks like for the individual is going to vary quite a bit. So if you're wealthy, your home might not look that much different than you might see in a typical very large city in the United States. So this landscape could easily be something you might see in New York or Chicago. Large high-rises, very clean. We have running water, we have sewage treatment. But if you're poor, your situation is going to look a lot more like you might see in Brazil. So those favelas that we talked about when we were talking about Brazil, right? As you can see, your home is made out of scavenged scraps. You're not going to have running water. You're not going to have electricity. Clearly, you're going to face a lot of those same hazards we talked about when we talked about Brazil. Landslides might happen in areas where there's more elevation. You might get outbreaks of disease because there's no way to prevent that. Again, waterborne disease is very common, unfortunately, in this part of the world because we do not have water treatment plants. You have no protection from natural disasters, so when those monsoons come, water is pretty much going in your house. So really huge difference between our wealthy and our poor in this area of the world. So the slum we're actually looking at in this image is actually in the center of Mumbai. So the city actually grows up around the poor area of town. And at this point, the government tried to make the people leave, but they won't do it. The people who are living there are like, nope, this is our area and we're not leaving. A lot of the people here, of course, are unemployed. They're working in the informal economy, but actually some people living there do have employment. They just aren't earning enough. So if you remember when we talked about, again, Latin America, talking about that idea between true urbanization and false urbanization, that's what we're seeing here. False urbanization, where the city just doesn't have the resources to support people coming to the city. So there's not enough jobs or high-paying jobs. There's not enough housing. There's not enough schools or other important resources for people in the city. So they end up living in this slum in Mumbai. It's actually really close to the public transit. So a lot of people are like, well, I have a job and I can live here where it's pretty much free and then get to my job. So the necessity is the mother of invention. And really a lot of people in this area have been able to create these amazing adaptations to living in an area where there's desperate poverty. So some of the things are things to trap water in order to have clean water, ways to wash their clothing, ways to cook their food, using biofuel, which we're going to talk about when we talk about the sacred cows of India. So they've come up with some ingenious ways to survive life in this type of environment. So as we move into that more industrialized India, we've moved away from being a colonial holding. We're starting to privatize and develop our domestic market. Also have trained many different scientists and physicians, again, in English-speaking schools. And so what we saw in the 1960s was the movement of physicians and scientists out of India into Britain. And why were they going there? Mainly for money, right? There, if you remember the push and the pull of migration, so the pull of Britain was they were experiencing this economic boom in the 1960s and doctors could get much higher pay as a result of that. So we call that the brain drain, right? So the movement of our educated individuals out of the area. So that happens in the 1960s and that pattern continues from that point on. So South Asian students decide to go to British or American universities and then end up staying in the UK or in the United States rather than going back to India because there's better paying jobs. Computer scientists and engineers in the 1990s start going over to California in particular. So by 2005, a very large portion of the people working at Microsoft are of South Asian descent, right? So in the IT sector. All right, so let's talk about religion in this region. So the dominant religion of India and Nepal is Hinduism. So Hindus are polytheistic, which means they have belief in multiple deities, right? So there is one ultimate god, Brahma, and various other deities. A lot of them are modeled after things that the individuals might have seen in their life. So, for example, elephant god, a monkey god, all those are part of the religion. So as a part of that, we have the caste system. So if you are familiar with this area of the world at all, it's one of those things that pops into your mind, right, is the caste system. So as you can see in the image, at the very bottom, we have what were once called the untouchables, now called the Dalits, right? So these are the ones that will clean the street, they clean the toilet, they're often, not given medical care. Then just above that are laborers, are farmers and traders and merchants, and finally at the very top, the Brahmins, who are the priests and the teachers, right? So our caste system is a system of kinship grouping. So it's based, again, on language, the region that you're in, and your occupation. And in your lifetime, you cannot move between castes. You will be in your caste for your lifetime, okay? So this is a formalized system that is actually global. Now, individuals who are in Britain or in the United States or what have you might not particularly follow this, or we might not see that, but if they were interacting with other individuals from that area and they're talking about their caste, you would see those practices come into place. So the caste includes the 4 basic groups, which are the Varna, right? And within that are Jati, which are the kinship groups. So you can move within the Jati, right? So you could marry other groups, but you're just not moving within your caste. And as I said, at the bottom of our group are the Dalits, formerly known as the untouchables. So at the very top are religious individuals or the learned individuals. They are not necessarily the highest class, or they're not necessarily the richest. It's actually had to do with scholarly learning or religious learning. So then next would be the people who have money or who are politicians. And then the lowest, right, are untouchables. So our lowest group, the Dalits, the untouchables, outside the caste system, and literally in the past, they would have been outside the city walls. They were thought that they could contaminate food with their touch or kill animals, so you weren't allowed to look at them or talk to them or touch them. So if they were sick, they were left to die. They got no schooling or treatment. So Dalits then, meaning the oppressed, those individuals who are, receiving no care or education, are now being able to receive some of those things. Unfortunately, while discrimination is outlawed, it still occurs. As a part of our religious system in this area, linked to Hinduism, is the sacred cows of India. So, I mentioned it before very briefly. And it's one of those things that if you know anything about India or have that image in your mind, you think about the cows. And people ask that question, why are there cows freely roaming the streets if we are practicing, or we're in such poverty? Well, they have as a part of their religion, non-violence towards animals, especially cows. Most people who are Hindu are also vegetarian. So why are they sacred? Well, that goes back to Lord Krishna, who is one of the powerful individuals in Hinduism. And about 5,000 years ago, it is said that he appeared as a cowherd, and it described as the child who protects the cows. So milk features pretty prominently in many of their religions. If you've been to an Indian restaurant, while a lot of the dishes are vegetarian, they also are featuring milk pretty heavily. It's an important part of their diet. So, anthropologists are interested in understanding, why do people not consume these cows? Why is it so important? Well, actually, having done some studies, realized that the cows can serve an important purpose without actually having to eat them. So clearly they use the milk that comes from the cows. They will also, if the cow dies of natural causes, they will eat it or use the materials. So they use the bone, they use the hide of the cow, and they will also use the dung. So I mentioned before that they're using biofuel. So if you've got a lot of cows in one area, you're going to have a lot of poop. So the people can actually use that poop as fuel, right? You can burn it to make light. You can also process it to make other types of energy, right? So to help maybe power a stove. So that biofuel is actually really important. So there's some more images of cows just walking around. All right, so other religions in this region include Buddhism. So we find Buddhism primarily in the Himalayas, so in the Tibetan region, as well as Sri Lanka. And as I said before, Buddha is actually from the northern part of India. So in basically the Gupta period is where he is born. He's born into an elite caste, so he is in the upper levels of society. He's wealthy, but instead he chooses to give up wealth for enlightenment, which they call nirvana. So the whole idea was that you're going to remove yourself from desire and material goods and instead follow an aesthetic path that would eventually lead you to attaining enlightenment. So finally, the other dominant religion in this region is Islam. So this is predominantly found in obviously Pakistan and Bangladesh, also found throughout India and Afghanistan. So there are more Muslims in South Asia than there are in the Middle East by number. So that's a little bit misleading because they are a lower percentage of the total number of people. So there is a higher population density in in South Asia than there is in the Middle East, which means that while there are more Muslims in South Asia, it's just because there's more people overall. So they're actually a lower percentage of the whole in this region. India is one of those areas where we see a lot of globalization. So I showed you that image before of scaffolding in New York. It's called Everest scaffolding, right? So these images and ideas from India making their way out of there and then kind of being adapted and changed as they come into our culture, right? So yoga, the practice of yoga. This is something that was associated with Jainism, right? And there's just Hinduism, Buddhism, right? And we practice it all the time here. It's very popular. Now it is a spiritual practice in this region of the world. Often here it's not a spiritual practice. It's a way to be healthy. Maybe there's some spirituality associated with it, but very different than the way it's practiced in India. So other things that you might see that are something from India is chai, right? So chai is actually a Ayurvedic drink. So Ayurveda is a dietary practice that has been followed for thousands of years in this region of the world, and it's based on your body type. So what your body does, is it hot or cold? Is it moist or dry? Are you fiery or are you kind of chill? And all of the components, or most of the components of our chai, are actually serving a purpose when you're practicing Ayurveda. So things like cinnamon and cloves and ginger are all warming spices. And we think that anyway, right? Those are all things that we might have in a pumpkin pie. So you have that at Thanksgiving, that warm sense, right? Or when you have a chai, it's like drinking liquid pumpkin pie. But in a Ayurvedic sense, those are fulfilling a purpose. So it's warming, it's giving moisture to people who are dry, right? It supplies actual purposes inside of Ayurveda. And as I said many times, very high population density in this area of the world. So this is actually as of 2008. My numbers are a little bit old, but at this point, 1.47 billion people in South Asia. So if you can see in this upper map, where you have that very dark red, is more than 1,000 people per square kilometer. And obviously most of India is in at least that, right? Especially in that area of our plains. Remember, that's where the rain is falling predominantly when we have our monsoon. So people are living there for farming and that type of practice. And as you can see, obviously in China as well. So our overall population density here is 819 people per square mile. And to give you an idea, 330 people per square mile in China, or 75 people per square mile in the United States. And again, those numbers are a little bit misleading. You know, things like places like New York or parts of New Jersey have a similar population density to China, so about 300 or so people per square mile. But there's obviously parts of the United States where there's very few people, like Wyoming, where there's more cows than people. So that's just taking that look overall. And that's why we see such a heavy population density in South Asia, in India, because it's a relatively small area. And as I said before, in our Indo-Gangic plain, so we have the Indus rivers and the Ganges rivers meeting, and in the coastal fringe, we have 1,300 people per square mile. So as I said before, our natural rates of increase. And we talk about natural rates of increase, what does that mean? So India has a very high birth rate. So natural rate of increase is your birth rate. How many people are being born who are natural citizens of that country? So most of the population of South Asia has that high natural birth rate. So people are having a lot of children. And then again, that forces people moving into the city. So that urbanization that I mentioned before. So by 2005, there's 50 cities that are greater than 1 million in South Asia. So as I said before, Mumbai growing from 4.1 to 20 million in, a 45-year span. So quickly urban. As a result, India put in place anti-natalist policies. So if you've heard the word natal before, maybe neonatal or prenatal, natal meaning baby, right? So people are trying to reduce the number of children you're having. So like I said, natural high increase of children in this area, we want to lower that number. So what do they do? So the government in India in the 1960s puts in place IUD camps. So what they were trying to do was insert IUDs into women, but unfortunately didn't work out very well, mainly because they didn't really have a lot of highly trained staff. They were unclean. And as you're going to see in the video for this week, Women by Women, a lot of women in this area of the world do not like talking about birth control practices. So this was just not very successful. Into the 1970s, the government says, okay, well, this wasn't working with women, let's try it with men. So they institute vasectomy camps. So 10 million men are given a vasectomy. Unfortunately, the same problem happens. They're not well trained and they're unsanitary, so a lot of the men don't want to do it. So that's not very successful either. So into the 1990s, the government recognizes that the most effective method that's going to curb our growth rate is the education of women. So we see this globally when women are just treated better overall, so getting more education, being able to work outside the home, etc., they're less likely to have numerous children because they choose to reduce the number of babies they have. And so the government starts to provide more education for women on a more equal basis. This area remains largely patriarchal, so male dominated, but women are given a little bit more freedom as a result of trying to limit this growth rate. And so there you're seeing in this map here, the number of children per woman. So in our areas where we have a lot of farming, and this is pretty typical across the world, you're going to have more children because you need a lot of children to help you run the farm. And as we move into areas where you have larger cities and maybe women are now leaving the home to go and work, they're going to have less children. So again, overall education of women lowering our birth rate. All right, so that is it for the human geography of South Asia. Now you just go and take your quiz on Canvas.